Boy, oh boy, hi everyone, Othany Boy Tano here, the internet's busiest music nerd, and it's time for a review of the new Marilyn Manson album, Heaven Upside Down. Lord of Darkness and shock rocker Marilyn Manson, he is back with his 10th full-length album here, one of my most anticipated rock records of the year, not only because I thought the lead-up singles to this album were pretty good, but also in this third leg of Manson's career, he's kind of been on an upward trajectory, beginning with a very rough start on Born Villain in 2012. I could appreciate Marilyn Manson embracing more of his post-punk influences on this thing and transitioning over from Interscope to a more independent venture, but the recording and the production on this thing, in my opinion, was hideous. I mean, whatever this album was, Chris Vrenna, who also worked on the high end of Low, could not save this thing. Manson would eventually go on to work with music producer and film composer Tyler Bates, who would help him come through with a somewhat hard bounce back on The Pale Emperor a few years ago. An album that would show Marilyn Manson channeling some of his old school industrial rock ferocity once again, but then also bringing in some classic hard rock into the fold. Some of these hard rock influences did play out a little awkwardly on this album, but there was certainly potential there. And rather than going through another reinvention, it seems like Marilyn Manson and one of his greatest musical collaborators, Twiggy Ramirez, as well as Tyler Bates once again, are kind of trying to hone the sound that they struck upon with Pale Emperor, which is admirable, but I wouldn't say their efforts really truly pan out. Initially with the singles and actually my first few listens to the album, I was kind of impressed with the raw, crunchy industrial rock riffs on this thing. But as I listened more, I found that there's just so little to this album beyond that. I mean, the opening track reads like a toothless version of the Irresponsible Hate anthem. And unfortunately, Manson just continues to live as a hammer without a nail or a gun without a target, as evidenced in just how tepid and general a lot of the lyrics on this record are, which a lot of the time don't really venture beyond Manson's usual blasphemous thematics, which honestly is still a weird position to see him in. I mean, maybe it would have made sense for him to be here in this spot. He's not quite as controversial as he used to be like 5 or 6 years ago. But now in 2017, we live in an age of Trump. People are more sensitive and outraged than ever. The fact that Marilyn Manson is doing so little to guide or channel this cultural fire is kind of disappointing, especially given his status as a showman and as a social lightning rod. As Manson said on Mechanical Animals, on the song Rock is Dead, the shock, it's all in your head. Which is true, but he used to be great at getting in people's heads. And that just doesn't seem to be the case anymore, especially on this new album. And I think there's a lot more to it than his time just being over or people just being desensitized to him. Most likely it's a result of Manson using his music now as more of a refuge than a weapon, which I can't entirely blame him for. I can't imagine what it's like to be public enemy number one, much less keep that reputation up for 1 decade after another. But still, Manson makes numerous lyrical references on this album to his usual targets as if his statements have the same impact they used to, and they don't, which again, is sad, because I feel like now we need a Marilyn Manson more than ever. An artist that's going to desperately bite at society's cultural wounds like a rabid wolf. But again, just not the case, given that some of the lyrics on this thing are so inoffensive, bordering on unintentionally hilarious, sucking up snow white powder. It just sounds like really bad coked up goth rock from the 80s. And when it comes to the subject of religion and Christian iconography, Manson just has nothing all that revolutionary to say at this point. It's like he's not just beating the dead horse, but he's constantly just stabbing it with a cattle prod. Of course, there are moments on this record, as Manson has often been in some of his second act and third act albums, where he gets kind of introspective and reflective on his image, on his fame, on his status in popular culture. Bloodhoney seems to be the most prime example of that, with Manson singing about how his audience loves to see him upside down in a way. Clearly he feels unhappy with the idea of being used and then left, or sort of being no more than an object for his audience, which surely is true to an extent, but is somewhat of a mischaracterization, at least from the standpoint of me as someone who loved his music in the past, because I don't love hearing Marilyn Manson himself upside down. I love hearing it when he's turning the world upside down. Although I guess the world is kind of already upside down right now, because there are scarier things than Marilyn Manson. Still, it's an incredibly anguished moment on the album, emotionally crippling to an extent, even if the mix is kind of messy with the keyboards like sounding way too loud, and they just do not slip into the guitars and drums that nicely. There were at least a couple tracks that I could see myself returning to, maybe SATURNALIA being one of them, which is easily the best post-punk throwback on the entire record. The nocturnal groove coming out of the drums, the nimble bass line, the spacey production, and the whole performance feels like almost like a loose jam. There's a roaring hook on this thing, and I'm definitely feeling like vibes coming from The Cure or Bauhaus, but with like a bit of an alt-metal twist. The song also hits one of the highest vocal intensity points for Manson toward the end of the track too. And then you had the very brooding "Kill for Me," loaded with dirty bass, really slick guitar licks, a very simple kick-clap pattern. It's dark, it's sexy, it's sensual. There's a sweet, glossy chorus on this track that sort of throws back to the Mechanical Animals era, and the lyrics are filled with these cultish nods to blood pacts and complete control. There are moments where I feel like the album is really lacking vocally. Manson's tortured moaning and shouting come off somewhat awkward and strained, like on the song Tattooed in Reverse. I can't be bridled, of course. Meanwhile, all the hard rock riffs that Manson finds himself on top of with this record, while they're a little better executed, like it sounds really clean, it sounds really well produced, but musically, it's kind of run-of-the-mill, and it sort of takes the wind out of the sails of the record, especially on the closer and the title track. I mean, this kind of instrumental backing just does very little to build up Manson's image, as does this album as a whole, because much of it, in my opinion, is very deflated, it's flaccid, it's got a couple of great tracks, a handful of moments that are admirably personal, but it's not like Manson hasn't reflected on his transition from shock rocker to just rocker. I could see the hardcore fans being more into this than I am, but honestly, I was pretty indifferent toward this thing. Like, the tunes on this record, a lot of the time, are just simply okay. Some of the lyrics are incredibly disappointing, and Extremity and Controversy are just so integral to Manson's band that to see him not deliver them in spades yet again just leaves me feeling kind of cold on this record. Feeling a light to decent 5 on this thing. Transition. Have you given this album a listen? Did you love it? Did you hate it? What would you rate it? You're the best. You're the best. What should I review next? Hit the like if you like. Please subscribe, and please don't cry. Just leave an angry comment on this video if you're angry, okay? And I'll see you guys in the next one. Over here next to my head is another Marilyn Manson review that you can click on and watch, or you can hit the link to subscribe to the channel. Marilyn Manson, heaven upside down forever.